In the Nepean River gorge, south of Sydney, there are 4 enormous concrete bridge piers rising out of the water with nothing connecting them. No deck, no steel, no rails, just 4 columns of concrete standing in a river, supporting air. Locals and urban explorers call it the bridge to nowhere. The NSW Government calls it a stranded asset. Both descriptions are accurate. The bridge was designed in 1983, had $30 million spent on it, and the railway it was part of was cancelled in 1988 and has been standing unfinished in that river gorge for 37 years while the government has spent millions more on studies trying to decide what to do about it. This is the story of the Maldon-Dombarton Railway, one of the most expensive unfinished infrastructure projects in Australian history, and a case study in how political ambition, commodity volatility, and engineering complexity can combine to produce a monument to miscalculation sitting in a river. Stay for the end, because the punchline is that the same arguments being used to justify completing this railway today are completely different from the arguments that justified building it in the first place, and the people making them may finally have a point. Why it was built. By the late 1970s, Australian coal exports were booming, and the railway network that was supposed to move coal from the western and southern coalfields to the coast was a mess. The freight routes passed through suburban Sydney, meaning heavy coal trains were competing with passenger services, subject to urban curfews, slowing on congested grades, and adding to the load on a metropolitan network that was not designed for bulk freight. The opening of a new coal loading facility at Port Kembla in 1982 intensified the problem. Port Kembla needed a direct, high-capacity freight line connecting it to the coalfields that did not pass through Sydney's passenger network at all. The solution seemed obvious. Cut a new standard-gauge freight corridor directly south from the main South Line at Maldon, a small junction west of Campbelltown, through the rugged Wollondilly and Illawarra terrain to join the existing Moss Vale and Andorra line at Dombarton, then descend to Port Kembla. 34.9 kilometres of new track that would bypass Sydney entirely, carry heavy coal trains without interfering with passenger services, and serve the export boom that showed no sign of slowing. In September 1983, Premier Neville Wran's Labor government formally announced the construction of the Maldon-Dombarton line. Completion date: 1986. Budget: $160 million. The project opened construction in December 1983. What the engineers encountered. The terrain between Maldon and Dombarton is not cooperative. The route had to cross the steep gorge of the Nepean River, pass beneath the Hume Highway and Picton Road near Wilton, traverse the metropolitan catchment area over the Cordeaux River, and then pierce the Illawarra Escarpment, the dramatic sandstone edge that separates the Sydney Basin from the coast, through a proposed 4-kilometre tunnel called the Avon Tunnel, which would have been the longest freight rail tunnel in Australia at the time. The earthworks began steadily. 25 kilometres of trackbed were graded, cut, and ballasted, about 70% of the total corridor length. Bridge abutments and concrete approach spans for the Nepean River crossing went up. At the Avon Tunnel site, crews established both portals and initiated underground boring. On the eastern section toward Dombarton and Port Kembla, track duplication was completed and overhead electrification masts were erected. Then the geology of the Illawarra Escarpment started creating problems. Tunneling through the sandstone and variable rock formations proved far more costly and time-consuming than the environmental impact assessments had calculated. The drinking water catchment zone added regulatory layers that slowed approvals. The budget started moving. The completion date of 1986 came and went without completion in sight. By early 1988, approximately $30 million had been spent on the direct Maldon-Dombarton corridor, and a further $57 million on related infrastructure upgrades between Dombarton and Port Kembla, $87 million total, on a project that had not yet laid a single metre of mainline track and whose defining engineering challenge, the Avon Tunnel, was still largely unboard. The coal price did not wait. The financial logic of the Maldon-Dombarton line was built on a single assumption, that Australian coal exports would keep growing. The late 1970s forecasts that justified the project had projected export tonnages through Port Kembla that would require a dedicated heavy freight line to manage. Those forecasts were, by 1987, turning out to be wrong. Global energy markets shifted. International demand for Australian coal softened. By early 1988, revised commodity projections indicated that coal export tonnages from the southern and western coalfields for 1990 would reach only one-third of the figures originally forecast in 1982. The thing the railway had been built to carry was not going to materialize in the quantities that made the railway financially justifiable. This is the vulnerability that infrastructure economists call single commodity risk. When you build an asset optimized for one thing, and that one thing changes, the entire financial case collapses simultaneously across every metric. There is no diversification. There is no fallback. There is a 4-kilometre hole in the Illawarra Escarpment that the government has paid $4.5 million to stop boring, and 4 concrete piers standing in the Nepean River. The political shift. In March 1988, New South Wales held a state election. Premier Rand's Labor Party, which had announced and commissioned the Maldon-Dombarton line, lost government. Nick Greiner's Liberal National Coalition came to power on a mandate of fiscal rationalism and public expenditure reform. Before the election, the coalition had committed to completing the line. After winning, the Greiner government cancelled it in June 1988. The stated grounds were the cost blowouts and the collapse of coal traffic demand. The contract for the Avon Tunnel was aborted, triggering $4.5 million in cancellation penalties paid directly to the contractor. Construction stopped. The crews left. The machinery was removed. The concrete bridge piers stayed. There were counter-arguments made at the time that the government chose to ignore. Opponents of the cancellation pointed out that inner Sydney freight facilities, the Balmain coal loader, the Glebe Island grain terminal, were facing closure, and the freight they currently handled would need to go somewhere. A direct freight corridor to Port Kembla, they argued, would absorb that displaced freight traffic and would earn its keep without the coal export volumes that had justified the original project. The Greiner government was not interested. The project was cancelled and the accounts were closed. The feasibility loop. What happened next is the part of the Maldon-Dombarton story that Australian infrastructure policy analysts cite most frequently, because it is a pattern that appears across multiple abandoned or stalled projects, the feasibility study loop. When a government cancels a major infrastructure project but cannot demolish what has already been built, and the underlying strategic logic for the project has not entirely disappeared, successive governments face a recurring pressure to revisit the decision. The politically easiest way to manage this pressure is to commission another study. The study takes time. The study costs money. The study produces findings. Those findings either support or do not support proceeding. If they support proceeding, the government funds another, more detailed study. If they do not support proceeding, the government points to the study as justification for inaction, while retaining the option to commission another study later. Between 1988 and 2024, the Maldon-Dombarton line generated 3 independent technical reviews in the 1990s, a full federal feasibility study in 2011 that led to a pre-construction announcement in 2012, a federal funding withdrawal in 2013 when the federal government changed, a formal private sector registration of interest process in 2014 that produced no viable submissions, and multiple Infrastructure Australia evaluations. At the time of the research underlying this script, the most recent Infrastructure Australia evaluation had calculated a benefit-cost ratio below 1.0 and declined to include the line's completion in the high-priority infrastructure list. The studies themselves cost millions. The total expenditure on studies and assessments in the decades after cancellation, on a project that cost $30 million to build to 70% earthworks completion, is not publicly consolidated in a single figure, which is itself a telling absence. The cost to complete the line also escalated dramatically during this period. The 1995 Kinhill engineer study put the completion cost at $160 million, the same as the original 1983 budget, but calculated a net present value of between negative $21 million and negative $73 million under various coal export scenarios, which is the metric that matters for public infrastructure investment decisions. By the 2011 federal study, the completion estimate had grown to between $600 million and $700 million. By the 2014 private sector process, it was $700 million to $800 million. The partially built infrastructure sitting in the landscape was not deteriorating in isolation. It was accumulating regulatory, environmental, and safety compliance costs every year it sat incomplete, raising the eventual bill while the feasibility window it required remained closed. Why private capital walked away. In September 2014, the NSW Government tried a different approach. Instead of seeking public funding, it launched a formal registration of interest inviting private consortia to propose commercial frameworks to design, build, operate, and maintain the railway without ongoing government subsidies. The theory was that if the freight demand existed, the private sector would recognize the commercial opportunity and bring the capital. The results were definitive. Of the submissions received, neither met the state's commercial sustainability criteria. The 2015 evaluation concluded that the line could not operate as a commercially self-sustaining entity without substantial ongoing taxpayer subsidies and government-enforced policy interventions to guarantee freight volumes. This outcome made explicit what the economic history of the project had been pointing toward for 30 years. Private capital demand certainty. A freight railway through the Illawarra Escarpment, serving coal mines facing depletion, in a market where access charges are regulated and global coal prices are volatile, does not offer the revenue predictability that private infrastructure investors require. The risk stays with the public sector. The private sector exits. The specific nail in the commercial coffin was the Tarmo coal mine, which had been projected to generate 22% of total railpath demand on the Maldon-Dombarton corridor. By the time of the 2016 Infrastructure Australia review, Tarmo was scheduled for closure, permanently eliminating nearly a quarter of the volume assumptions built into every business case produced since 1983. The comparison that matters. Subscribe before the final section, because I want to tell you about the one comparable Australian railway project that found its way back from abandonment, and why that precedent may or may not apply here. The Sandy Hollow-Merivale Railway in northern New South Wales was authorised in 1927 and construction started in 1937 as a Depression-era employment relief scheme. Work was abandoned mid-construction in 1951 due to post-war capital shortages. For nearly 3 decades, its unlined tunnels and overgrown earthworks looked essentially identical to what Maldon-Dombarton looks like today. Then, in the late 1970s, massive coal reserves were discovered at Ulan, directly along the route the unfinished railway was already pointing toward. A private company, White Industries, stepped in, completed the missing infrastructure, and opened the Sandy Hollow-Golgong line in 1982. Private capital completed a decades-abandoned railway because the commodity it was designed to carry had arrived in exactly the quantity needed, directly accessible from the unfinished alignment. Maldon-Dombarton is the inverse of that story. It was abandoned because the commodity it was designed to carry, export coal, contracted precisely as the construction peaked. The coal that would have justified the line was not discovered along the route after abandonment. It was forecast before construction and then failed to materialize at the projected scale. The question for the bridge to nowhere is whether a different commodity can substitute for coal as the traffic justification. And here, the story has genuinely changed. What has changed? The strategic rationale being advanced in 2026 for completing the Maldon-Dombarton line is not about coal. It is about intermodal container freight, agricultural exports from Western New South Wales, and the emerging logistics needs of the Western Sydney Aerotropolis and the new Western Sydney Airport. The argument is straightforward. Western Sydney is growing rapidly. Wollondilly, Macarthur, and Camden are among the fastest developing LG as in the country. The Mount Ousley Road between Wollongong and Sydney is one of the most congested freight corridors in New South Wales, handling enormous volumes of truck traffic that have no viable rail alternative. A direct freight rail connection between Port Kembla, the Southern Highlands, and the Western Sydney Airport logistics zone could divert thousands of heavy vehicles off that road daily. The external costs of road freight, congestion, emissions, accidents, road wear are substantially higher per tonne-kilometre than rail freight, and those external costs fall on the public regardless of whether the railway is built. This argument is structurally different from the 1983 coal case in one important way. It does not depend on the export trajectory of a single commodity. Container freight, agricultural produce, and airport logistics represent diverse and growing traffic streams that are not tied to a single mine's output or a single global commodity price. The Cranbourne commuter line in Victoria demonstrated that a stranded regional asset can be resurrected by population growth converting a regional branch into a metropolitan necessity. Western Sydney's growth may be providing the Maldon-Dombarton line with its Cranbourne moment. Whether that argument is sufficient to justify $700 million to $800 million in public capital against an Infrastructure Australia benefit-cost ratio that was below 1.0 as recently as 2016, depends entirely on how the policy frameworks value road safety improvements, carbon emissions reduction, long-term supply chain resilience, and the external costs of doing nothing. Those are political decisions as much as economic ones. The concrete bridge piers in the Nepean River gorge have been standing for 37 years. The Avon Tunnel portals were sealed. The earthworks are overgrown. The ballast beds have deteriorated. The project has been studied, restudied, offered to the private sector, declined, reviewed by Infrastructure Australia, and declined again. It has cost more to fail to build than it cost to start building. What the Maldon-Dombarton line represents, more than anything, is what happens when a capital-intensive infrastructure project is justified by a single commodity forecast that does not survive contact with the global economy. The bridge was built to carry coal. The coal did not come. The bridge stays in the river, pointing at the other bank, waiting for someone to decide what it should carry instead. If you want more of the Australian infrastructure stories that the official project pages do not cover, subscribe. We go deep every week.